Hello there, leftist fam, and the probably 12 people that find this video. Um, my name's Durga, and I have been writing occasionally on Medium and sometimes do dissidents under Adventures in the Free World. I am not a vlogger, I am a writer, and only an occasional writer at that, at least on politics. But I have been paying an inordinate amount of attention to politics and the political discourse, especially leftist spaces, for the last 8 or 9 years. And it has been a very eventful week with some particular interviews that Dr. Cornel West has been doing recently, especially an interview that he did with Jimmy Dore. And the types of discussion and the contradictions that interview has raised, meaning the contradictions that have existed among the left for a really long time that I think were illustrated probably now more clearly than ever. So I have thoughts on this, and because I am not trying to make a career out of being a political writer or a vlogger. I have spent a lot of time listening in these spaces, listening to most of the leftist media, sharing things on my own social media, excuse me, occasionally writing about it. But I don't really have the ear of any of the current commentators or hosts to be able to filter this message through them. So I'm just going to say some things that are on my mind based on my observations of all of these different conversations. And I believe that I am probably not the only person that has had these thoughts. But they raise very strong concerns for me as someone who is a committed leftist that really wants to see actual movement in this country in a left populist direction with class struggle at the front and center, but also ultimately with the goal of equality and or equity, whichever is the best serves the goal for everyone. And I feel very discouraged and disappointed after seeing this interview with Jimmy Dore and Dr. West. I have long had a lot of respect for both of them. I only came to know Dr. West through the Bernie Sanders campaign. I was not familiar with him before that. I was an enthusiastic supporter early on of the People's Party efforts and both of their efforts in the People's Party convention, and was pretty active in the 2020 Bernie Sanders campaign and a supporter in the 2016 Bernie Sanders campaign. And a longtime reader, fairly longtime reader of Chris Hedges as well. So what I am seeing among the left is going to be, in my opinion, the death of us being able to make any real progress other than just have a bunch of arguments online if we don't get our shit together. And I haven't seen it roundly getting addressed, at least not in a way that satisfies me. I can't say that I've seen every conversation and every live stream. Nobody's seen all of them. But here is what I mean. And first, to set up the context, I want to start by saying that when I refer to left, I mean everybody that has left the Democratic Party. So leftist and leftism begins at anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, and not compromising with the bourgeoisie. So to me, the distinction between progressives and leftists is very simply one of theories of change, reformists versus revolution. And the reformists are the progressives, mostly from the former Bernie Sanders movement, who are still choosing, for an array of reasons, to vote Democrat. And I'm not going to spend any time on that. Most of us have heard all of those reasons ad infinitum. I myself am tired of hearing them. I'm tired of even debating them. I have no energy or time left for trying to educate people who are still uh, talking about trying to reform the Democratic Party or change it from the inside. If that's your thing, then I would recommend finding yourself Chris Hedges' 2009 book, Death of the Liberal Class, giving it a very in-depth read. If you are not going to read books, then find his lecture tour from when that book came out and watch that lecture and those interviews by the same title. If you are still thinking that the Democrats are even a little bit aligned with leftist causes, then this is probably not even going to be the discussion for you. You need to catch up your political literacy. I'm sorry to say. That's just the facts. So moving on, speaking of the left, it's been discouraging to see what has happened on the left since Bernie Sanders abandoned his own movement, if there even was a movement, in 2020. It does not seem like we have gotten any kind of organization. There's a lot of cynicism. There's a lot of resignation. There's a lot of disagreement about priorities, what to do, how to do it. The only thing that seems to unite the left the only thing that seems to unite the left is that we agree on the theory of change, that we must work outside of the two-party system in order to get anything at all done, which is a great starting point. It's unfortunate that there are so many people who haven't even arrived at that conclusion yet. And I personally feel very frustrated and cynical about that, because it seems as though we now have so much evidence accumulated that the Democratic Party cannot be reformed, in addition to voices like Chris Hedges and others that have proven this from a longer historical standpoint, that there's really no excuse to continue maintaining that belief any longer, unless a person is just somehow materially invested in the way that the status quo has personally benefited them, and wanting to cover that up and sound more progressive than they actually are. I mean, I could be wrong about that, but that is certainly how it looks to me. For anybody that wants to go down that rabbit hole, I wrote an article on Medium under Adventures in the Free World about the history of the number of times that Democrats have sabotaged progressives within the party at the presidential level. I put together a detailed timeline going all the way back to the JFK election to show that Bernie Sanders is not the first time that that has happened, and it's definitely not going to be the last. So that's not really the topic of this video. I realized that I went off in a little bit of a different direction than how I started, just to set up the context for this. However, getting to Jimmy Dore and Cornel West's conversation, which I think probably everybody can agree was a total shit show. And I don't think that it was either person's fault, and it is not causing me to withdraw my support from either of them. I have been following Jimmy Dore and Dr. West long enough to know, I think, where their commitment lies. And so a communication breakdown and some ideological disparities is not a deal breaker for me. However, these communication breakdowns and these contradictions that were highlighted, I think needed to come out. So, if anything, um, the upside of this entire interview is that it really made pretty explicitly clear the contradictions that are among leftists, leftist media hosts, commentators, voters, leftist audience in general. And what was partially revealing about these contradictions was the conversations that happened after this interview on channels that did their own analysis of the interview. For example, Tim Black's channel, Savvy Sab's Revolutionary Blackout. I have listened to those analyses and was sometimes present on the live stream when those analyses were happening, and trying to get through with some points that I'm going to raise here that just were not being received in those moments. But the analysis that I think is the most salient, the most incisive, and the most insightful, far and away, is the analysis that Garland Nixon did of the Jimmy Dore and Cornel West interview. I personally recommend that everybody listen to that analysis. I think that honestly, he is the only person that got it right in certain ways. I'm not saying that everybody else was wrong, but I'm saying that Garland Nixon managed to fill in some crucial missing context about the source of the communication breakdowns between Jimmy Dore and Dr. West. And then he put it in the larger context of the same type of conflicts that arose when Jimmy Dore interviewed Marianne Williamson and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Why is this important to the left, just like on a macro level? Well, because it is so revealing of some of the fundamental disagreements that we have, and the fundamental ways that we have not been able to overcome our particular theories of change, and what priorities we think need to come first, second, and third, and even fundamental differences about where we think Dr. West's center of gravity needs to be in order for his campaign to succeed. I'm seeing some people feel like Dr. West's center of gravity needs to be focused on their particular demographics, material interests. Tim Black, for example. And I'm not specifically or agreeing or disagreeing with that. That's just an observation. And conversely, I'm seeing that Jimmy Dore was trying to get a message across to Dr. West that in order to broaden his appeal, the way in which he's communicating his positions needs to be more accessible to the disparate audience that Dr. West is trying to reach. And that has been very misinterpreted by a lot of people that I could see as Jimmy Dore trying to tell Dr. West to change his message or change what he stands for. In fact, that is what it seemed like Dr. West was reacting to in the interview. If I'm coming from kind of a pop psychology lens, and I am not a psychologist, but I have hung out in therapist spaces for a long time and just kind of done a lot of self-study about the way that people tick and how we form our cognitive maps of the world and the way we view things, the filters through which we hear and process information and other people's opinions, and the way in which we react, right? And so I could see, I feel like pretty clearly, where Dr. West was coming from and where Jimmy Dore was coming from, as well as these various left media channels, the hosts, the commentators, their audiences, the panels, all of that kind of stuff, and have kind of, I feel like, an overall summary of what seems to be going on. So I'm not claiming to be like the sole expert on this, but um, I feel like because I've had the time on my hands to um, really listen to so many of these conversations and just kind of deeply observe and think about what I'm seeing, I have some unique observations that are valuable to the conversation at large. So, where was I? Okay. There is an old maxim in sales. I've worked in a lot of sales jobs. There's an old maxim in sales that perception is everything, right? So, what does that mean? Perception of it's everything does not mean that perception is the truth. However, what it does mean is that people in general, um, the way that they perceive information, um, and filter it through layers of cognitive bias, confirmation bias, which is slightly different from cognitive bias, the context of their lives, the individual experiences they're bringing to the table, um, what is most important or prescient for them that they're specifically listening for, what is most emotionally charged for them, and what is most prioritized or deprioritized in their mind, which things have the most emphasis, forms how people perceive what they're hearing when another person speaks. And that perception to, all of us, this is just kind of a flaw of how the human psyche evolved, is for each of us our reality. And so in sales, when we say perception is reality, what we mean is that we have to adapt our message to the lens that the other person is viewing things through. And so that means having a measure of insight and empathy and emotional intelligence in order to be able to um, see that and adapt that message. It does not mean having to change the message fundamentally or change what we stand for, right? In sales, you don't really stand for anything. So it's kind of, it's not a perfect metaphor, but just roll with me for a second on this, right? But it does mean that we have to be able to language it in such a way that it can be heard, right? There's another maxim. Do you want to be right or do you want to be heard? Do you want to vent and get some relief from just kind of venting your frustration, or do you want to be heard, right? If you want to be heard, you have to be able to adapt how you are communicating in order to speak to the other person's listening, right? And get through their filters. So, obviously, with Jimmy Dore and Cornel West, they were just unable to do this with each other in this interview. And more broadly, I see this same obstacle coming up in the leftist discourse uh, all the time. And it also comes up, obviously, between leftists and progressives, which is why nobody can seem to have a constructive conversation about why reformism is not going to work, right? Progressives and leftists just can't hear each other. Reformers and revolutionaries can't hear each other. They just can't. If anybody has managed to bridge that divide like a little bit, I would say that Brianna Joy Gray has probably done a pretty good job in some instances with that, as well as being able to keep her cool in conversations that I would find inordinately frustrating. So back to my point. Garland Nixon brought up some really solid and valuable insights when he evaluated the context of Dr. West's life and where his views and communication comes from, having spent so much time in academic bubbles, particularly liberal academic bubbles, right? Scholarly language, scholarly worldview. I noticed that this limitation came up a lot. My dad was in academia for a long time. He was tenured faculty at a university. And for quite a long time, he was married to someone else who was tenured faculty at a university. And their set of assumptions that they just kind of assume are the things that like everybody knows about um, were very disconnected from that of the general public. Like what is assumed to be kind of the baseline of like this is stuff that everybody knows in academia is not the same thing as what everybody outside of academic circles knows, right? I have seen this kind of I've seen this show up in some of the messaging with Dr. West. And this really seems pretty clearly to me to be one of the fundamental points that Jimmy Dore was trying to get across is that, Dr. West, you are losing a lot of the audience that you're saying that you want to reach by speaking over their heads. When you go on liberal media channels like CNN and MSNBC, you're doing an awesome job because these are people who have been in the same academic bubbles and they place a high value on conventional education and scholarly language and people who sound articulate. I mean, articulate like the actual definition of the word, not articulate the way people say, oh, that's a racist thing to say if a black person's being articulate. I don't mean that. Articulate and have an elevated vocabulary and be able to reference a lot of literature and things like that. People on liberal conventional media, they love that shit. And liberal professional managerial class voters love that. So when Dr. West communicates in that way in those circles, it is a very successful way for him to get them to drop their guard and embrace what he's saying and give him more airtime on those networks than he would probably ordinarily get. He's very disarming. He calls everybody brother and sister. He speaks their language, and because they don't really have anything to refute him, that's not going to make them look like assholes or kind of be antithetical to their class identity. He is able to be in those spaces in a way that is successfully getting his messaging across. But what Jimmy Dore is trying to get across, and what I've been feeling like in watching a lot of Dr. West's recent interviews and seeing where his campaign is or is not gaining momentum, is the broad spectrum of people who have had very firm systemic critique that the entire system needs to go. There are no good faith actors in this game whatsoever. Neither one of the two parties is better or worse than the other, or quite possibly, there is a very solid argument for saying that the Democratic Party is worse. Why is it worse? Because the Democratic Party is still successfully carrying on this grift that they're the good guys, whereas Republicans are all pretty in line with each other, right? Because of the aspirational nature of Republican voters, including the more working class Republican voters. They do not have the negative view of the billionaire class and the 1% often than what we do on the left. So they don't have a problem with Republican politicians giving money to the 1% and representing the interests of the 1% to the degree that we do. Those among the conservative faction that are frustrated with this and that are more economic populists were attracted to Trump's message. I know most of us know this already, because Trump was the only person that was bothering to address their material interest. Okay, now, why is it that Jimmy Dore is concerned that Dr. West's message is not going to reach this group effectively? Well, because he's speaking this academic language that not only doesn't appeal to them, but is not that easy to understand. Like, you really have to do a lot of gymnastics and do a lot of waiting for Dr. West to get to the punchline. When people raise very explicit issues, such as, what are you specifically going to do to make my life better? And I feel like this has gotten missed in some of these discussions and these analyses. The level of frustration on a lot of the left in having invested years of our lives believing in figures like Bernie Sanders and putting our money and our time and our energy behind the Sanders campaign, believing that we actually had a movement, that believing that we had a real political revolution with a whole lot of people, millions of people in this country that were actually all on the same side for things like a federal jobs guarantee, ending imperialism, taking control of our climate destiny, having a proper social safety net, and economic redistribution of money and power to the poor and working classes, a nationalized healthcare system, all of these things. So many of us believed that we really had millions and millions of people united behind this movement. And we have suffered a cascading series of betrayals since April 8th, 2020, when Bernie Sanders dropped out again. And just to remind everybody, Bernie Sanders quit in the middle of the biggest test case for Medicare for all that anybody could have possibly conceived of. I mean, a global pandemic. You can't get a bigger test case for for Medicare for all and an American nationalized healthcare system than a global freaking pandemic. And he had all of this momentum behind him and would have won, and he quit. And then what happened 5 minutes later is millions of these progressives that those of us on the left thought were on the same side with us turned around and started calling us the same names that we had all been getting called by PMC bourgeois liberals, because we said we are not going to vote for Joe Biden. Every name in the book. And then all of these failed pandemic policies came down one after another. And those of us on the left that called this out from the beginning and said, this is about social control. This has nothing to do with public health. Why is anybody putting their trust or their faith into a profit-based health system that we all agreed, or at least I thought we agreed, was a bad, fucked up, completely broken system not to be trusted? All of a sudden, all these people that 5 minutes ago were for Medicare for all are telling those of us who are expressing any kind of skepticism whatsoever that we should die screaming for not getting the COVID-19 drug protocols. I'm not going to use certain words since this is YouTube, right? For not wearing masks that the medical establishment admitted at the beginning didn't work. They're calling us every name in the book. They're telling us we shouldn't receive medical care. We should get thrown in jail. People should take our kids, right? These were burners. So, and this is only a couple of examples of the level of betrayal. And then we watched all of these elected progressives like AOC and the Squad and Jamal Bowman just sell out one after another and reveal themselves to be nothing but sheepdogs for the Democrats, like nothing but controlled opposition. And so when you fast forward to this moment in 2023, a couple of months ago, with Dr. West announcing his candidacy to run, you got to understand how much so many of us have to overcome to even put our cynicism and resignation aside a little bit just to have any excitement or any faith in a Cornel West Green Party campaign at all. To be willing to put any energy there, any money, any time, any effort, any of it. Already the bar has been raised by a factor of 100,000. And so when you see the type of frustration that Jimmy Dore was expressing, understand that Jimmy Dore is not alone in that. And I think it's very unfortunate that when he got frustrated, he made some pretty sweeping generalizations and that I think were unfair, accusing Dr. West of just shilling for Joe Biden and some other things. But then Dr. West was doing the same thing, accusing him of pandering to Trump voters, accusing him of covertly being a Trump supporter. Like, both of these were just completely bad faith accusations on the part of both parties, and it was really disappointing to see. The level of frustration that exists on the left exists for a whole lot of valid reasons. And when we who have been waiting to see an actual revolution or an actual movement, like some kind of coalition, getting its shit together at the grassroots and doing something, like literally anything in some sort of united way that makes some kind of movement. The primary concern for myself, and I think, probably, not just me, is how do we get a candidate like Dr. West, who has so many advantages in this political moment, right? He has the advantage of his name and his long track record of activism and all of the knowledge and understanding that he brings to the table, right? And his extraordinary compassion for people and his willingness to see the best in a lot of ways in other people and certainly have far more patience with a lot of different types than I have, for sure. Um, these advantages are not going to do anything for any of us if they are not perceived by the people that Dr. West is trying to reach. And Dr. West himself has said he wants to reach Trump voters. How many times has he said that he wants to reach Trump voters? So many times. How many times has he said he wants to reach the white working class? How many times has he said he wants to reach non-voters, independents who are on the fence, right? And then let's take a look at what are the advantages and disadvantages of having Robert F. Kennedy and Marianne Williamson currently in the race. Okay, well, we could probably just conclude logically that Marianne Williamson's voters and Kennedy's voters are also former Bernie Sanders people, people that are disaffected with the Democratic Party by and large. Many of them may still adhere to the reformist mythology right now, but there is a reason they are not supporting Joe Biden and that they're obviously not supporting Donald Trump. All of us on the left know that both Marianne Williamson and Robert F. Kennedy are going to be forced out of the Democratic primary at some point, and that neither of them are going to be running third-party campaigns in the general election for a variety of reasons. We know this to be fact. So what is going to happen to their voters should be something that is a concern for all of us, because they are part of the coalition that we need to build. We need the Kennedy coalition. We need the Williamson coalition. We need the non-voter coalition. We need the independents. We need the Trump supporters. And we need the libertarians who aren't all that enamored with Trump and aren't necessarily in love with any of the Republicans either, but have a massive problem with a lot of the woke ideology that has been sucking the oxygen out of leftist political discourse. And if we want to build coalitions with those people, then that means that all of us need to learn how to communicate with all those different types of people, and foremost among us, Dr. West. Let's talk about Dr. West's deficiencies that were revealed in the Jimmy Dore interview that are sources of frustration, I know, for myself, as well as for a lot of the people who are currently very supportive of Robert F. Kennedy, and who are a pretty consistent audience on media channels such as Convo Couch and Hard Lens Media, and often Jimmy Dore. There are single issue voters in this election, and I can tell you definitively from having observed and spoken to a lot of people online and in person that the number one reason that people supporting Robert F. Kennedy are supporting Robert F. Kennedy are because of his position on the pandemic. Bar none. And a close second is his position on the Ukraine war. Their primary concerns, and whether they take the 1 and 2 position, it's really pretty interchangeable, are number one, bodily sovereignty and not being subjected to state mandated medical intervention, and not having a nuclear war with the world number 2 nuclear power. That is it. Dr. West is very clear on his position with Ukraine and imperialism and militarism, to his credit. Where he falls short is his position on the COVID-19 pandemic. And that was revealed in the Jimmy Dore interview. But I have been seeing that deficiency over many, 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 many conversations that Dr. West has had. It came out when Hardlands Media interviewed him. It came out when Pasta Jardula interviewed him on Convo Couch. And this is something that has remained unresolved. I have been personally disappointed in the fact that Revolutionary Blackout Network and Sabby Sabs and Tim Black don't seem to be prioritizing this issue. In fact, I heard Sabby Sabs even say on one of her live streams, Black people don't care about COVID-19. Not only do I disagree about that, the fact remains that millions of people who are not Black definitely do care about that issue. And those millions of people are people that we need behind Dr. West if we want his campaign to get traction and create the level of disruption that I am pretty sure we are all hoping he will have, regardless of whether people believe that Dr. West can or will win the 2024 election. Anybody who is voting for him or even considering voting for him is doing so for ideological reasons. If we were voting based on who we think can win the election, we would not be voting for Dr. West right now, because we all know that a Green Party campaign is a long shot campaign. But certainly we have some sort of investment in him getting as far as possible. I would love to see him win, and I don't think it is impossible for him to do so if he plays his cards right. But regardless, in order for his campaign to have an impact, it needs to cause mass disruption. And for it to cause mass disruption, it needs to pull a lot of votes away from both major parties, from as broad of a spectrum of citizens as possible. And ignoring how very, very top of mind the scam that was the entire pandemic and the government's response to it, and the media apparatchiks' rabid censorship of the discourse is not going to help the leftist cause at all. Personally, this week, on dozens of comment threads, I saw people that have been on the fence between Kennedy and Dr. West, or saying, for some reasons I'm not going to judge, are supporting Kennedy in the primary and then planning to support Dr. West in the general election, for example, as well as people who have been on the fence, explicitly say, after watching the Jimmy Dore interview, they're done. They're not supporting Dr. West anymore. That is a deal breaker for them, bar none. And it is really, really unfortunate to see how many people on the left don't understand why that is the case. And it's baffling to me personally because of things such as the Tuskegee experiment, right? I mean, it cannot be unknown to us on the left how much of a fraught relationship the American Black population has had with the medical establishment in this country, and the number of times that they have been treated as guinea pigs by the medical establishment, going back more than a century, the Tuskegee experiment being only one of those times. And combined with the data, which I can't cite off the top of my head, but I definitely did read and see and evaluate the data that Black folks are had the smallest percentage of vaccine uptake in this country during the COVID-19 pandemic. That right there tells you that it is factually unsupported to say that Black people don't care about COVID-19. That's one of the issues where it really seems to have just fallen on deaf ears. But then we have also, well, there's more than one thing. So that was the one that stood out to me the most because it was something that I was personally listening for the most. Moving on to the next issue, however, that came up, and this is one that if we don't find a way to start having some constructive discussions about it and really communicate and align ourselves, I think that leftists in this country are not going to get anywhere at all. And this one is really, really, really concerning. Okay, I tried to pause that. One second. Okay, I'm back. So the issue that I'm referring to is the issue of prioritizing class struggle versus prioritizing specific issues that apply most to specific demographics. For example, race and racism. And so that nobody misinterprets what I mean when I say apply to specific demographics, I don't mean that racism doesn't affect everybody or that racist policies are not a detriment to all of us, because they are. However, there has been a lot of tension in leftist circles and a lot of disagreement about what messaging a united left needs to prioritize, and what policies a united left needs to prioritize. This is something that became very apparent with the Jimmy Dore interview with Dr. West. And it is something that was commented on quite a bit in Savvy Sab's analysis, who I think accurately points out that race and class are inseparable. And she showed an excellent video in her discussion about this from a woman that I think was on TikTok that pointed out the ways in which racist policies in the United States have been used against the white working class, including something I did not know, but I just recently learned that going all the way back to the Teddy Roosevelt administration, and several subsequent presidential administrations, the choice not to implement a national healthcare system was based on an explicit choice not to give Black people health care. So that was really great insight on the part of Savvy Sabs, and a huge contribution overall. I did not know that, and I have definitely been of a mind to prioritize class struggle first and foremost, because class is what unites. And class struggle is what most immediately benefits the material interest of the entire poor and working class, right? And what immediately assuages the pain that is universal to everybody in the poor and working class, meaning our joint material economic interests. It is interesting to learn the nuances of the way that class and race interact, and I have been learning that more as time has gone on. However, I do feel like Tim Black's assessment was kind of a bad faith argument, and I don't think that Tim Black is operating in bad faith. I think he has a very valid position and is obviously very passionate about representing the interest of the Black community and the Black voter base as well. He should. Um, however, um, Jimmy Dore made some very good points that you can't lead with race if you want to build these coalitions. And it is not because these coalitions are inherently racist, but if you look at the lens through which so many people are viewing the political landscape in the context of their lives, there's a lot of catching up that a lot of people have to do to even get to this baseline assumption that so many of us on the left have based on our uh, significantly greater amount of time that we spend in these spaces and thinking about this stuff and talking about it and evaluating it. Like a majority of Americans don't have these conversations. They don't spend this kind of time. They don't read the books that we've read. They don't hang out on the live streams. They don't listen to the podcasts. They don't watch the documentaries. They haven't read any Marx. They don't understand why social democracy is not ultimately a solution. Most of them don't even understand why capitalism is the problem. Okay. They have a lot of catching up to do to even arrive at the starting line of where we tend to assume all discussions begin, which is that capitalism and white supremacy are inseparable because they're one and the same. And in order to get rid of white supremacy, you have to get rid of capitalism. In order to get rid of capitalism, you probably have to get rid of white supremacy. So class first or race first becomes this exhaustive chicken and egg question that just ends up being kind of a circular firing squad among the left. And it gets really frustrating to listen to the way people are discussing this because nobody seems to be able to stick to the issue without getting all twisted up in their emotions and their personal bias. There is a principle in 12-step program that 12-step programs are based upon, which is probably the core reason why 12-step programs, including Alcoholics Anonymous, have managed to survive as organizations ever since 1939 and survive all over the world. And that principle is that we place principles before personalities. And I have long wished that humanity would just adopt that overall as praxis. Like, can we please put principles before personalities? And on the left, I feel like that's something that we really need to look at. It is a detriment to us when we get caught up in personality wars with each other over this type of issue. And I think accusations such as something that Tim Black spent a lot of time on in the first 20 minutes of his commentary about this interview, accusations that white leftists purposely don't prioritize race, and that it's not that white people don't understand racism, it's just that we don't think it's important. We don't want to talk about it. We don't want to make it a priority when it comes to leftist discourse and activism. I think it's really unfortunate. I can't tell somebody not to feel the way that they feel. I think it is unfortunate that that is how Tim Black connected the dots. In my experience, that's not true. I know that it's not true for me. It's not true among the leftists that I have personally had conversations. I can't speak for all non-Black leftists, obviously, but it is just not the trend that I've seen in the discourse. What I have seen is for those of us who had an exhaustive number of discussions with Trump voters and with libertarians during the two Bernie Sanders campaigns, I feel like we are uniquely more tuned into what their specific motivations and concerns are. And it is easy for people who have not bothered to have those conversations to just operate on so many fundamental assumptions. For example, that everybody that voted for Trump is a racist. Um, I will tell you right now that here in Florida, where I live, in 2016, Hillary Clinton was so popular in the cities. Florida is really not a red state, it's a purple state, definitely a swing state. In the cities, there is a predominance of bourgeois liberalism and conventional Democrats. That is consistent, unfortunately, even with the Bernie movements that were here in Florida among the different counties, our revolution, Florida for Bernie Sanders. These were all the progressives that, unfortunately, it didn't take them 5 minutes to turn right around and say that they were going to vote for Joe Biden, and are constantly trying to drum up support for Democrats in the state, right? These are, predominantly in the cities. In the suburbs and the more rural areas, well, in the suburbs, there's more of a mix. In the more rural areas, you have the more conservative Trump type voters. And then in South Florida, where there's a high percentage of Cuban immigrants, keep in mind that the Cuban immigrants that have been in this country for generations, whose ancestors mostly emigrated to the United States, under Batista, were bourgeois Cubans among the top 1%, who were very affluent and who were involved in the sugar production and other monopolies that were largely controlled by United States interests and the Italian mafia and the political establishment under Batista. When they escaped to protect their own material interests. And so their view of socialism and communism has been framed by what they feel like Castro did to their families. And that has continued forward through those ancestral lines. And so most of South Florida is very conservative, at least those with Cuban ethnicity. So this is just an example of what the demographic is in this state, which you could use to extrapolate probably similar swing states. But where I was going with that was to say, I actually kind of forgot for a minute where I was going with that, to be honest, but it's coming back. I was so angry at the Democrats for what they did to Bernie Sanders in 2016, and so acutely aware of Hillary Clinton's political record and her agenda and the agenda of the Clintons and the Democratic Party, that I stood in the voting booth in 2016 for 20 whole minutes, grappling between writing in Bernie Sanders, voting for Jill Stein because the Green Party is on the ballot in Florida, or voting for Donald Trump. And I ended up voting for Donald Trump because it was such a close race that Hillary Clinton really could have won in Florida. I'm not alone. And Dr. West has said it, all of us have said it, so I don't want to be redundant and repeat things that I think most people on the left already know, that a large percentage of Trump voters in either of the 2016 or 2020 elections were people who just wanted to throw a grenade into the whole system, or who wanted to make a point to the Democrats, or had other reasons for, you know, feeling that the Democrat candidate was actually the worst candidate and voting against them the same way people who voted for Democrats voted for Donald Trump. So there's a lot of disingenuousness in the way that we on the left are characterizing each other when we get into these disagreements. And I think I didn't realize I was shaking the I was shaking the camera a little bit. Yeah, I am. Oops. Okay. And they're getting in the way of us being able to build a coalition, in my opinion. I feel like these are things that need to be much more roundly addressed, and they need to be addressed specifically by Dr. West, and by the media commentators and hosts that are most invested in Dr. West's campaign, and they need to be addressed by the Green Party and the various state Green parties. Because if we cannot get into alignment with each other, then Dr. West's campaign is just going to be one of dozens of Green Party campaigns that could have been something and um, end up just being something that people talk about years later in political analysis. I mean, Dr. West is uniquely positioned because of his name recognition and his long track record and all of the other things he's bringing to the table. But um, it is time for the campaign to have a very clear and explicit direction. And it is time for all of the conversations that Dr. West engages in to start being very specifically focused on policy and platform and what it is that he's going to do, addressing these things, not from a standpoint of this is what I believe, this is my life's work, this is my ideology, this is the lineage I came from, insert jazz metaphor here, Fannie Lou Hamer, Curtis Mayfield, legacy, legacy, legacy. And I don't want to sound like I'm dismissing those things, because in the beginning, when Dr. West first announced his campaign and those early interviews, that was all very inspiring to hear. As a musician, I love that Dr. West is a musician and passionate about music and passionate about jazz. I love the metaphor that he uses, that a white keyboardist in James Brown's band, forgive me, I'm not from that generation, so I don't know the names of everybody in those bands, is not a white ally. He's in the band, right? These are really useful things up to a point. But at some point, the language needs to be a lot cleaner and clearer and less flowery, less academic, more specific, to be able to say, here's the problem, here's my position on the problem, here's what I propose to do about the problem. And it has to be that direct. And it has to be in a way that everybody listening can understand. Furthermore, we need to start talking about what the left would have to do in order to be supportive of these policies should Dr. West actually get into office. And this is something that has been bothering me actually quite a bit as I've listened to live streams, because people have let it slip. I heard Kit let it slip on Hardlands. I heard it slip on Due Dissidence. I heard it slip just the other day on Revolutionary Blackout Network's live stream about, I think it was about the Trump indictments, when Nick Cruz said that his dream for the 2024 election is that the liberal class actually manages to succeed and throw Donald Trump in jail, and Donald Trump wins the election from jail anyway. I heard that and I thought immediately, what the hell is Nick Cruz talking about? Because here you are on a network that has been platforming and interviewing Dr. Cornel West about his presidential campaign since June, and now you're talking like you're not serious about him winning this election. So what is that about? That's a blatant contradiction. All of us, I think, probably agree that a Green Party candidate winning the presidential race is a long shot. But we have also been apprised enough of the numbers as far as the 100 million eligible voters that don't vote at all, and the 47% of registered voters who are registered independents, and the 20% of black people who have defected from the Democratic Party and are now supporting Donald Trump, and the I think it was in one poll 52 or 54% of overall voters saying they're considering third parties for 2024. And then there was another poll recently that was like a similar percentage, around 50% of Democrats actively considering third parties in 2024. So if we're seeing all this data and we're even sometimes talking about these things, then why is anybody in other conversations saying unserious things that allude to not really expecting Dr. West or the Green Party to be in it to win it? So I don't know what that's about. But as someone who wants to see him get as far as he can possibly get, regardless of whether he wins, I think that would be wonderful. I think it's entirely possible. But to cause maximum disruption and do maximum damage to the Democratic Party, it's time to get serious on how to start aligning ourselves and talk as though we expect to have to get our asses in gear if he's in office. Because every single one of us knows there's not a thing that Cornel West or anybody else will be able to do as President of the United States if he doesn't have an epic leftist coalition mobilized from the grassroots and united around common cause. And I don't know why this hasn't been front and center of all of the discussions, particularly on media channels that focus generally on movement politics. Where is the movement building around the Cornel West campaign? And why am I not seeing it happening? I don't understand this. But arguing at each other over class versus race is not going to get this shit done. I want to bring up an article that someone in the RBN chat put me onto that I read just this week. He was speaking of Mao Zedong's critiques of what he refers to as primary and secondary contradictions. Now, I do not have enough of a grasp on this concept to speak about it at length in an educated way. I understand what this particular article was talking about, and I think that it really bears discussing because it seems to address a lot of what's going on with the disparate groups of people on the left disagreeing about which priorities need to be first, second, and third at any given moment when organizing a leftist movement and making leftist policy decisions. Mao Zedong apparently referred to anti-capitalist movements as having primary contradictions, which are generally, or a primary contradiction, which is generally the contradiction that is central to the entire movement. He cites that primary contradiction as being class struggle, right? So the ultimate uniting thread among everybody on the left, regardless of race or demographic, is that we are either poor or working class or advocating for poor and working class issues and redistributive economic policy and redistribution of power and influence to the poor and working class. So that would be what Mao Zedong referred to as the primary contradiction. He talks about other things as being secondary and tertiary contradictions and so forth, meaning things like race, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, which wasn't a thing in Mao's day, but certainly seems to be a thing now, and so forth. And further into the article, he makes some commentary about what we now refer to as intersectionality. That term was coined much more recently than Mao was around, so he doesn't call it intersectionality. But there were a couple of people that pointed out on the RBN chat stream about this Jimmy Dore Dr. West interview that historically intersectionality has never worked as a strategy for left populist or anti-capitalist movements. And the reasons that this article points out in terms of primary and secondary contradictions are that when you incorporate intersectionality in a movement, you are going to continually run into the barrier of conflicting interests. And that seems to be happening on the left quite a bit in a lot of these discussions about particular socio-cultural concerns that have a outsized impact on one or the other demographic. For example, an outsized impact on the Black community, or on women, or the trans community. And this is something that I think is only going to get resolved through constructive and reasoned discussion, where we can put principles before personalities and deal with the issues and allow our personal experience and emotional landscape to take a bit of a back seat. I also think we have to have some sort of agreement on the paradigm from which we are operating as a leftist movement. I don't exactly know how that will be achieved, but it's not getting achieved at all now. And I haven't really seen any constructive discourse happening, or anything that seems to be moving this forward or resolving anything. And it has been increasingly frustrating for me to watch, because all of us on the left actually are committed to, if not identical, a very similar ideology. Foremost, anti-capitalism and anti-imperialism. And if we are going to make traction with either one of those things, we can't be constantly accusing each other of acting in bad faith, or pandering to Trump voters, or being covert racists, or only wanting what's going to represent or do something for their particular racial or demographic group. So it really seems like what went wrong with the interview between Jimmy Dore and Dr. West in their interview this week is emblematic of a lot of the underlying tension among people on the left as a whole. And I think it encapsulates on a macro level a lot of the stuff that is needed to be addressed on the left for a very long time. So, as I said in the beginning, it really served a very valuable purpose that it brought this stuff out. And for anyone who has not listened to Garland Nixon's analysis, I'm going to link that in the description of this video. I'm also going to link that article that I referred to about Mao and primary and secondary contradictions. But I really feel like Garland Nixon nailed it out of all of the analysis. and I've listened to all of them. And then on a tangentially related note, listening to the discussion between Brianna Joy Gray with Crystal Ball and Kyle Kulinski, um, also illustrated this tension and these contradictions. And they're going to continue to be an obstacle for any genuine leftist activism until they are addressed and dealt with in a much more explicit and constructive way. I think that Garland Nixon did such an amazing job of his analysis because he gave very specific details about um, why the communication breakdown happened, along with specific details on the issues where Dr. West really does not seem to be well versed, or if he's not well versed, he simply minimizes these issues. And one of the major ones that has come up in many conversations is the minimization of the role of the Democrats and Joe Biden as being milquetoast as opposed to being just as evil as the Republican Party, if not more so. And Nixon points out the Justice Department's handling of the never ending array of persecution against Donald Trump, as opposed to the way that they have handled Hunter Biden in 2020 and the way that they're handling the Joe Biden and Hunter Biden scandal with Ukraine now. So those are really valid critiques. Another thing that Nixon brought up is that, I mentioned at the beginning that Dr. West's academic circles have given him unique ability to speak the language of other liberals in those academic circles. But where Jimmy Dore was coming from is as somebody who has been uniquely more tapped into what we would call the white working class, or really, I would say the multi ethnic working class, as well as people who are libertarians, anarchists, voted for Trump for an array of reasons, not necessarily because they actually like or support Trump, but because they just don't like any of the system, and they like the Democrats even less. And, the audience that Jimmy Dore is privy to and has spent more time talking to um, speaks in a much plainer and more direct language than the way in which Dr. West has been communicating his message since he announced his campaign. And this is to Dr. West's detriment right now. This is something that Jimmy Dore tried over and over again to point out. And I was disappointed to see how defensive Dr. West was consistently, and then continually just kind of doubled down on his defensiveness and accused Jimmy Dore of acting in bad faith, pandering to a Trump audience. This is something that Tim Black said, and a lot of people on the Tim Black channel said over and over again, and seem to be very strongly convinced of. I don't think that does any of us any favors at all, the way that Dr. West responded to those critiques. And it was also very sad to see Jimmy Dore's frustration get to a point where, he was exceedingly abrasive in some moments and also made some of the same types of unconstructive, maybe even unfair blanket statements about Dr. West. What I have observed about Jimmy Dore is that he is very committed to leftist policy and that he does not confront, challenge, or argue with people about something if he doesn't care about it. So, Jimmy Dore seems to come from the school of tough love, which is something that I can respect. Sometimes you just have to be very direct with people, especially if it seems like they're not getting it. And I saw Jimmy Dore just feeling aghast that certain things that, due to how he viewed Dr. West and the his superior intellect, which is something Jimmy Dore would say himself, and the breadth of his knowledge and experience, Jimmy Dore was expecting that Dr. West knew a lot of this stuff already, particularly about things like the World Economic Forum, the arrival of central bank digital currencies, social credit systems, vaccine passports, COVID policy, and why these things are an existential threat to all of us imminently, not somewhere far off in the future, but imminent threats. And Dore expressed his frustration with West kind of in the way that you express yourself with somebody when you've gotten to a point where you feel like shocking them out of their bubble is the only way to get through to them at all. And, I understand that Dr. West felt disrespected by that, and it was very sad for me to see. I mean, the whole interview was like, you know, watching mom and dad fighting, or like your two best friends having this epic fight with each other and leaving at a place where you don't know if they're ever going to make up, and now you feel like you have to choose sides. It didn't make either of them look good. And I would very much hope that they decide to reach out to one another and have this conversation again and really give it the type of time and consideration it deserves. I also suggest that we convene a large panel discussion among all of the leftist media, a multiracial panel among all of the leftist media, and hash out these disagreements for once and for all. And I think in order to do that, we need a moderator. We need a moderator who can be reasoned and rational and keep their shit together and have a balanced view of everybody. And I personally suggest that moderator be Garland Nixon. I can't think of somebody better, or perhaps maybe Chris Hedges also would be a great moderator for that discussion. I think the Green Party needs to start addressing this. I think that the Cornel West campaign and the Green Party need to sit down and have a discussion and align what Dr. West's platform is actually going to be. And I'm not talking about just what's on his website. There are contradictions with what's on Dr. West's website and what is on the Green Party's website. One of the things that's still on the Green Party's website is that they endorse vaccine mandates, COVID lockdowns, and mask mandates. And with multiple pandemics on the horizon because of climate change, we got to figure out what exactly the stance on this is going to be. And I just want to remind all the people out there who seem to think that this is no big deal, that this is an absolute deal breaker for many, many, many people on the left and many more people that are potentially part of Dr. West's base of support. Once they can feel assured that he is with them on his issue and that he will not allow any policy to go forward that is going to be a state violation of bodily and medical sovereignty, among other things. So I also want to suggest, I am not a podcast host. I'm not a political vlogger. I have, again, written, like I said. I would love for anybody who happens to see this to check out my work on Medium and the couple articles I've published on Due Dissidence. It is under Adventures in the Free World. But I want to offer to interview Dr. West myself. I have specific questions that have been in mind since he announced his campaign. I have watched every interview that Dr. West has done on all of the podcasts across the spectrum. I've watched him on Tavis Smiley and The Breakfast Club and RBN and Tim Black and Hardlands and Convo Couch and all of them, and Jimmy Dore now. And I feel like I could contribute to the conversation in the type of discussion that I would personally like to have with Dr. West. To qualify this, it is not my aspiration to suddenly become a political commentator or a vlogger on a regular basis. So don't expect to see that from me. However, on this channel, Adventures in the Free World originally started as the brand I created when it was my intention to be location independent or a digital nomad, as a travel photographer and travel vlogger. That's a project that did not get off the ground and life went in another direction. But Adventures in the Free World also conveys pretty succinctly what I guess you could say is my personal brand when it comes to politics and socio-cultural issues. So now, instead of talking to myself by posting my questions and views in chat streams on other people's podcasts, or waiting for my articles on Medium to hit more than 100 views, or waiting to get invited on to do Dissidents again. That's not a jab, by the way. It's just a fact. I haven't been on that show in a year. I'm just going to turn on my camera and give my insights here, either before or after I write about them. And for any of you who feel that there is some value to what I'm saying, please feel free to share, subscribe, support it, leave your comments, include me in your discussions on your channels. If you're convening a panel, you want to have some people call in or sit in. I have a limited amount of time as somebody who's a full-time student right now to commit to activism and political conversation, but I certainly want to do whatever I can with my unique perspective and talents to move the conversation forward and hopefully to move a revolution forward. I don't want to be responsible for having to start the revolution, but I will show up for it whenever we actually get one together. And so I'm going to just stick this thing up on YouTube. I will probably send it out to some of these other channels. If I can find a direct address for the West campaign and the Green Party, I'll send it there. For the dozen of you that will listen to this, I really thank you for your time. And one other qualifying statement, because I did say I'm happy to engage in discussion and see people's comments. I'm only willing to engage in good faith, constructive discussion that is issues and policy focused. So I am not interested in spending any time trying to educate liberals or reformists on why they need to leave the Democratic Party. I'm not going to entertain accusations of being class reductionist or racist, or, I don't even know. I've been called every name in the book as a leftist now in the last 8 years. I was banned from Twitter during the Iowa caucuses for trolling Neera Tanden and Jason Johnson. Never been allowed on Twitter again, and I am routinely thrown in Facebook jail. So, I may not be for everybody, but I know that I am not only talking to myself, and I know that I'm not the only person that is thinking like I am. So, where I am at today after this week and after the most recent interviews on Revolutionary Blackout, Jimmy Dore, Tim Black, a couple other places with Dr. Cornel West, is I think that this campaign is going to fizzle out if Dr. West doesn't get his ass in gear. I don't mean that disrespectfully, it's just an expression. And if we don't get our asses in gear with honing and communicating clearly an explicit direction with explicit policy positions, not beliefs, not ideologies, not what we support, not what we're for, what it is we're going to do to address specific things and what the role of Dr. West will be should he get into office, what the role of Dr. West's voters and supporters needs to be if he gets into office, but also what that role needs to be now and what that role needs to be moving forward, because this is movement politics. And movement politics does not start or end within a specific political campaign or with a specific politician. And I'm so very glad that Sabby Sabs brought this up in her analysis about this interview. I feel like it's missing from the conversation in some places. I've noticed it particularly on Tim Black's channel, people succumbing to hero worship again. And if anybody has learned anything from the Bernie Sanders movement, there are no heroes in this game. There are no heroes in the political game. We do not need to be coddling any of our politicians, and that includes Dr. West. And, you know, for the amount of love and respect that I am sure all of us have for Dr. West, we have to stay true to the movement. And now that he's entered the political space as a candidate, it is our responsibility to consistently push him on the issues and push him to get better at the way that he's getting his message out. And that is what I saw Jimmy Dore trying to do. I do not think that Jimmy Dore or Dr. West were intentionally being disrespectful of one another. I do think that they were talking past each other. I think there was a massive communication breakdown, which, like I said, was a microcosmic example of the communication breakdowns that have been happening all over the leftist space since the beginning of the Bernie Sanders movement, at least. I wasn't involved with the leftist movement before then, so I can't speak to whatever has been happening for, years earlier than that. But certainly since 2015, these same disagreements around these same specific disparities in paradigm have been surfacing again and again. And I think that it is time for that stuff to get addressed. So, again, I really appreciate you listening. I am going to sign off now. This is my take on the matter. As I think of more things, I will post more things. I'm not committing to a consistent schedule, but, check back here probably on a weekly basis if you want to. Because I've realized that trying to participate in the conversation through commenting on other people's videos or contributing in the chat streams or even sending emails to these individual show hosts or writing on Medium, it's just not a productive use of my time. I might as well be talking to myself. So I might as well be talking to myself here on YouTube as well. We'll find out. But this way, when something is on my mind, I can turn on the camera and get it off my mind. And if it finds a few people and it starts a few discussions or contributes something to the discourse, then I'm very happy to do so. So I wish all of you a blessed day or evening wherever you are. And I hope that you have found something to grab onto that in some way causes you to consider something that you had not previously considered. So have a wonderful day, guys. I will talk with you again soon.